Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer.
Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Where we once sang, "Sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us," in response to being taunted and insulted, this idiom, like so many other childhood memories, turned out to be untrue. The words we use have taken a deeper significance, and they can be extremely hurtful and painful. Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones is the name of this podcast series. It's also part of my PhD dissertation project with the University of British Columbia's Social Justice Institute, as we explore the science, psychology, cultural, and emotional components of these conversational ecosystems and what they have in common to gain insight and improve on existing knowledge of how we engage with each other, whether about climate, race, gender, culture, politics, or social justice issues. I hope you'll join us. In our first episode of Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones, we're speaking with Teun van Dijk. Teun is a Dutch linguist who studies language structure, development, and use. He's made significant contributions to discourse analysis, and he's expert at how language both reflects and constructs the social world. Teun was professor of discourse studies at the University of Amsterdam until 2004. He's currently the director of the Centre of Discourse Studies and professor at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. After earlier work on generative poetics, text grammar, and the psychology of text processing, his work since the 80s has taken a more critical perspective and deals with discursive racism, news in the press, ideology, knowledge, and context. He's the author of many books in most of these areas, and he's edited the Handbook of Discourse Analysis. Teun is a rock star professor and understands the words we use better than most, and I'm thrilled that we get to spend some time with him. So let's get started. Thank you very much. It's so nice to see you.
See you too.
It's a real honor to sit here with you. I appreciate your time and your patience.
Welcome.
Would you mind introducing yourself and just telling us a little bit about your journey? Because it's quite a fascinating story.
It's also a long journey. I just turned 80 and many years, of course, to account for. But let's do it in a few minutes because otherwise it gets boring. I mean, it's nicer to have a real conversation. And I would like to hear also things you would like to tell me, of course. Actually, I was first a student of French language and literature. That's how I started. And as a student of French in Amsterdam, I also went to study in Strasbourg in France for a year. And I studied also after my PhD. No, just before my PhD, also I studied in Paris with very famous people, being in the classes like Roland Barthes. And this particular kind of people, well known in semiotics. So, and I was in classes of Grémas. So that's how I started. And my first interest was actually in doing the analysis of poetry. And my first work as a student was to analyze surrealist French poetry of Paul Éluard in France. That's how I started. And the advantage is that when you do analysis of poetry, you really take every word seriously. And I think that is one of the reasons why then I moved very quickly to a more linguistic analysis, because I did not want to have some kind of intuitive kind of literary analysis. I wanted to do a real scientific study of literature. Actually, my first books in Dutch are on literary theory. So that's how I started. And then I moved to linguistic. This text analysis, my dissertation is on that. And then that's in the 70s already. And then many things in text analysis could not be done in linguistics, because linguistics doesn't have things like coherence of discourse and this kind of thing. So I went to study, as I always do, in another discipline. So I moved to cognitive psychology, where you had ideas which were not very common in linguistics. So then I started to work with psychology in the United States, Walter Kinch, and we worked on actually a book and papers on the strategies of discourse comprehension. So, mental strategies. So that was, let's say, the first part of my academic life. But already at the 70s, more and more, I just wanted not just to do linguistic text analysis on the one hand, and not even cognitive text analysis, which is fascinating because in psychology, we had lots of interesting developments that people were not doing. But I also was interested in social stuff. And after being in Mexico for some time, I thought, well, we should do not just discourse analysis, text grammar, and not just cognitive analysis, which is fascinating and afterwards became very, very successful. But I also wanted to do more social stuff. So I started to do things in what later was called critical discourse studies. And my first studies in the 1980s was in racism and racist discourse. And that actually been doing until today, because until today I'm always working on racism and later also on anti-racism. But that had very steps, which I can summarize in 1 minute. I started to do how in the Netherlands, for example, the media was reporting about immigration. That's the first book in Dutch, and then also many other papers in English. And then a little bit later, we also took contact with people in Austria, like Ruth Wodak, and in England, like Norman Fairclough. And more critical discourse analysis became some kind of a movement. And within that movement, I continued to work on racism always, like racism in the media, racism in politics, racism in textbooks, mostly what they call the 3 Ps, like professors, journalists in Spanish, periodistas, of course, and politicians. And then within that framework of critical discourse analysis, I also was very much interested until today in studies of ideology. So I did a book on ideology. I was also then interested in things people always said they were doing, namely analysis of context. So I also did a book on context. And in order to be able to continue to work on ideology, I also thought, well, there's something else in the mind which is even more important than ideology, which is knowledge. So I did a book on knowledge. After 2 books on anti-racist discourse and its history in Brazil, and also in Europe, the United States, and so on, I now just finished a book more interested in social movements. So I did a book on discourse of social movements applied to the movement of refugees welcome, especially in Europe. And that's, I don't know how many minutes, but that's, a big summary of what I've been doing for the last 50 years.
I read an article recently that said your work has been located at the intersection of racism, power structures, ideology, and discourse. And from what you've just said, that almost seems too small.
Well, I've been doing many things, yes.
I want to see if you can unpack this for us. An interview with Stephen Sondheim and D.T. Max. And Stephen Sondheim said, my idea is that every moment of human intercourse, like right now between you and me, there are 64 of you in this room and 64 of me in this room that we bring into a conversation. So every sentence we say, any intercourse we have is filled with layers. Can you help us unpack what he's saying and how that relates to the complexities of discourse in our conversations?
Well, that would, if I would do this correctly, it would take much more than 3 minutes. But let's just summarize this again. I mean, people sometimes forget how complex something as simple as an everyday conversation can be, even our conversation. And, as you know, in conversation analysis, which is one of the fields related to discourse analysis and discourse studies, people have been doing this work now since the 1970s. Many, even small details. But another thing, for example, if you think of the work I've been doing with Walter Kinch on the psychology of discourse processing, if you think what in fractions of seconds our mind must do to even read a simple children's story or to understand a simple conversation, that's just amazing. And I think most psychologists don't even realize how complicated that is. Processing is going on. You have to understand a word, its meaning, which is being associated, as we now know also from cognitive linguistics, to lots of knowledge of the world. I won't elaborate all these points, but then it takes an hour or more. So that's just a word, but then you have to find out that how the word fits in a clause and the sentence structure. So that means unpacking lots of syntax with Noam Chomsky and many others in the world have been known for many years. And that's just grammar. And then we come to the meaning, not only for a word, but of a whole sentence. And then we come to semantics, which is halfway in knowledge of the world, in psychology, in logic, and so on and so on. It is not even a simple introduction to discourse semantics in the world. You know that? And I wanted to do such a book many years ago. And that's just talking about the meaning of sentences. And most of the work in semantics is actually don't even go much further. But as soon as you come to sequences of sentences, even small discourse like children's stories and so on, and people started to do that in the 70s. There was a PhD of a guy in the United States working for the first time in artificial intelligence and computer comprehension. And he unpacked what is necessary to even understand a simple children's story, you know, all the inferences and so on and so on. And that's a simple story. I'm not talking now about a complex thing as a news article in the newspaper. So if you unpack all these things, you have to do the semantics, but also it had its style. You have to know specific kinds of style, and that it may have specific kind of rhetoric with lots of emphasis or not, or whatever, metaphors and so on and so on. And that's just that kind of thing. But at the same time, there is, of course, lots of ideology. And in order to understand this particular fraction of discourse, you have to unpack not only that particular structure of discourse at least 15 layers of complexity, but also the knowledge involved and the ideology involved. So know what kind of ideology is involved and so on and so on. And that is just one discourse. But as soon as you talk about conversation and dialogue, I also need to know what your knowledge is. So I have to have some mind reading I have to do. I adapt what I'm saying like now to what I think you know and don't know. So if you would know nothing about language and so on, I would have to explain even things like syntax, which I don't do. So these layers is correct. There is many layers, from even sound structure, which I didn't even mention, to word structure, to clause structure, to sentence structure, to sequence structure, to whole pieces of discourse like headlines of newspaper articles or conclusions in papers, and many other aspects of discourse, which in early linguistics were not even studied. All right. So there are many structures of discourse, and that's just a linguistic analysis. But at the same time, you need also a cognitive analysis of how this works and how people understand it. You need an interaction analysis about how do I project not only this particular kind of text, but also the context. Like, for example, I now have to adapt not only to what you are understanding or what people listening to us are understanding, but also there is some interaction going on. So I must do also not only analysis of the text or the discourse, but also of the context of an interview and so on and so on. So the question of these layers is a very simple metaphor. It's even much more complicated. And we all do these kind of things in fractions of seconds. And I bet you that most cognitive psychologists have no idea.
So just to jump into this hole a little deeper, how do cultural, societal, or demographic factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, or political affiliation influence the dynamics of our conversations?
Well, it depends what kind of conversation it is. If I talk with you, for example, about if you have children, or let's talk about my granddaughters. All right. So one of my granddaughters soon is going to be a student of biology in Utrecht and so on. Or the other one is already a student, a little bit older, and so on and so on and so on. So we have this whole conversation, and there's no influence, not of race, gender, except that they're young women and so on and so on. But it's not an ideologically interesting conversation. But as soon as I'm talking about things like the radical right here in Spain, then automatically ideologies come up, ideologies in Canada come up, and so on and so on. And I was reading this afternoon a book about conspiracy theories in many countries. So then all these things come. So most of the kind of public discourse we talk about, like in the media, social media, newspapers, television, as soon as you talk about the world, ideologies come up. And then all these things like race, gender, sexuality, and many other types of ideology come up. And then another point is that we begin after 50 years of discourse analysis, we have some idea, not complete, about the structures of text and talk. Okay? We know about that. But as you well say, that doesn't mean that we know the relationship between all these structures of discourse and other complex structures in the world, which things like ideology. If, for example, we now have elections here in Spain, and the question is who is going to govern, the right, the conservative right with the extreme right, which are racist, sexist, and, like anywhere else. Or if it's the continuing government of the socialists who are now in charge. So the relationship of these structures of discourse with these complex socio-cognitive political structures of society is just extremely complicated. I mean, when the head of government here takes a view about, who is going to govern, what is going to do, he not only has to know what he's saying, how he does it with this kind of meaning and this kind of rhetoric, this kind of style, so influence people and so many, many things. But at the same time, he has to think, what are these people thinking about socialism or being at the left? And what does at the left mean? What does progressive mean? Do I get more or do I get less votes because of this? So the things get so incredibly complicated that let's be honest, people in political science have been working on this for many, many years. They also have no inkling yet about the structures they are involved with when we talk about the talk of politicians in this particular kind of situation. So we have an intermingling of things in linguistics, discourse analysis, and political science, and social science, and cognitive science, and all together. And then you are only still, at the surface. So it is very complicated.
I'm interested in your comment about the conversations you have with your granddaughter. I suppose we all have those filtered or safe conversations with our kids. And it brings up a point. You said in a recent interview that racist prejudice is not innate but learned, and that it's largely learned through the many discussions in everyday life, such as family talk, all forms of media, textbooks, and so on. And I suppose my question is, aren't all or many of our values and beliefs formed that way?
Yeah, exactly. Of course, none of this and not completely, because that's the debate we have with Noam Chomsky, how much of what we have here is innate or not. So he would say, many other people said, the structure of language, because of evolution, is already pre-programmed in a way, okay? Certain kind of things already, even before we learned to speak a couple of 100,000 years ago, these kind of things, because of the way we handle our life interaction, how we see nature and how we survive, all these things already prepared our brain also to deal with language, which we finally discovered a couple of 100 years ago. All right, so that's one thing. But the question then is, how much of this interaction, even before we talk about language, also has to do with something which is honest or not honest, and we can trust or not trust people, and that's vital. You don't have to be speaking human to do that, and even primitive people, men and women, they have to know whether you can trust someone or not, and so on and so on. So probably already many, many years ago in our development, we learn about norms and values, and that society is based on these particular kind of things, which much later by philosophy was made explicit, and so on and so on. Someone is just has just been born, doesn't have language yet, but probably is prepared to learn specific kind of language structures. and maybe also for specific kinds of norms and values. But the actual norms and values still have to be learned. And these are learned obviously through parents and caregivers and so on and so on. So, and that's with many other things. And for example, ideologies, they are not learned in the first years of, people learn complex things like, let's say, socialist or a feminist or a racist ideology. They usually learn in the later stage in adolescence and afterwards. So all these things have to be learned, yes. And we don't get into this world as racist or sexist and so on. It's all learned. But there are psychologists who say that many of these things have to do with character, your personality. And it's just a continuance of this old idea of the authoritarian personality of Adorno, then people who are sort of authoritarian, they like order and so on and so on, and they tend to vote actually for the right-wing party. So there is some kind of relationship between personality and political choice. But I'm not interested so much in personality of people. I'm interested in what whole groups of people do in a socialist movement or a leftist movement, or what goes on in the world now with right-wing people. I'm much less interested in the actual personal variation of people, but as a cognitive psychologist, that is also very interesting to do, but I'm more interested in public discourse than in individual development, which I may leave to individual psychologists. But it's a personal thing, and it's definitely interesting.
I was thinking earlier in your comment, one of the questions that I was struck on, I wasn't going to ask it, but what are the conditions that lead to memory accuracy or bias?
We are now talking about different kind of things. I mean, lack of memory, and so memory limitations are inherent in our brain, right? We cannot understand infinitely long sentences or sentences which are extremely very complex and so on and so on. So the limitations of brain span. That's one thing. And many other complex things have to do, of course. But I'm not so much interested in what human beings in general can do or not can do. I'm much more interested in what they actually do, okay? So, because I don't know. And of course, cognitive psychologists know a lot about this, but also it's limited. They don't know how much time you need, for example, to become a racist or a sexist and so on. I'm interested in, if people learn these things, how do they learn it, in what kind of situation, what kind of conditions, what kind of things do they actually read, with what people have they been talking and so on and so on. I'm much less interested in that one particular kind of person who is more authoritarian or not picks up this kind of things more readily than other things. Why, for example, I was reading this book this afternoon about conspiracy theories and so on. So why is it that many people believe the most crazy conspiracy theories? Why some people do it and why don't people? And this book's written by a journalist, a British journalist. The book is interesting, but it's not a scientific book. It's simply interesting. But my question then is, why is it that certain kind of people, and there are not just a few, but hundreds, thousands, millions, believe so? And then I checked on the internet, actually in the afternoon, and said, let me see who believes what in what country. And it's just amazing how percentages in various countries, people believe in the most incredible things. So, and we think about modern times. When I read that, I have doubts about whether we live at all in what is called postmodernism. I think we live in pre-modernism.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's a really interesting point of view and a much longer discussion by itself. You've written many books and papers on racism, the news, different ideologies, and how they impact discourse. And you just talked about writing about and specifically researching anti-racist discourse in Europe, the USA, Brazil, and more recently you wrote a book on social movement discourse. Can you share some examples of what you've learned and successful applications of your theories?
I have been working on racism and racist discourse since the early 80s. Okay, so I've been doing that for now more than 40 years. So within this whole field of what we call critical discourse studies, with many people in many countries, all right, it's like like a scientific movement, all right? But the funny thing is, in critical discourse studies, we have always been focusing on the bad guys, so to speak, on racists and so on. But we seem to forget that it's also interesting not only to study racist newspaper articles and racist textbooks or racist conversation of people at the right and this kind of thing, but I also interested in anti-racist discourse, how people resist this particular kind of thing, how they protest and don't accept it, or how, for example, in the movement of refugees welcome, people are interested in things like solidarity. Why would they go to all kinds of places in Europe to receive hundreds of thousands of refugees in various countries? Why is that so? So working on racist discourse, there's in the structure of racist discourse and the ideologies which are behind that. The question then is, if people are resisting this kind of thing in resistance discourse, like social movements and so, like, for example, Black Lives Matter, okay? Classical example. So they also have their discourses. So I became interested also in what are the structures of discourse of anti-racist people. And also because I'm always having three dimensions in my work: structure of discourse, structures of what happens here, the mind, and structures in society. These three go together. So that's crucial. So I was interested in the structures of anti-racist discourse and the ideology of anti-racism, and also in the movement of anti-racism, and the same thing for all other kinds of things. So this is what I try to do, to what I knew a little bit now about racist ideology. The question then is there also something like an anti-racist ideology with norms and views like equality, justice, and so on? And I think there are, and that's what I try to do in these books. And the history, I trace back 2,000 years of people working or talking against, for example, slavery. And I found that there are, yes, through the times, there's several kinds of strategies or structures of anti-racist discourse, which are very, very general. And you find 500 years ago, 400 years ago, until Black Lives Matter today. So this is kind of things I find. And also, for example, analyzing interviews with people who went to help refugees from England in other countries in Europe, how if they were interviewed, I was interested, what are they actually saying? So one of the things we find, for example, is that they use all kinds of modesty structures. They say, it was nothing, I was just helping, So you find in ways in which these volunteers actually are showing some kind of, many women, by the way, showing some modesty. And the structures of these discourses are not bragging, look what I've been doing, but on the contrary, they did lots of work and they're always downtoning, mitigating the work they've been doing. That's a typical structure of volunteer discourse, So looking at many of these things, hundreds and thousands, you see this particular kind of thing.
I was thumbing through my copy of your book, Anti-Racist Discourse, and I was struck by one of Alicia Garza's strategies, which is that she doesn't speak about hate against white vigilantes or police officers, but rather of love for her people. So her strategy is different, and I keep looking for this one-size-fits-all, and maybe it's as simple as just love, but I'm curious what we do, or where do we find the strategy to fill in that gap between DeSantis and Black Lives Matter? What about the dog whistles and embedded messaging in conversations or in political speeches? So if there's a question there, it's what practical interventions, strategies, or tools can be developed or implemented to facilitate more effective and constructive conversations or discourse amongst individuals or groups.
There is not just one thing. What I'm doing, I'm just an old-fashioned empiricist. I study what people actually do. And of course, one always wanted to draw conclusions. And because also I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for more than 50 years. So I want to teach, and not only through research, but also tell students to do a good dissertation, do it in this way, this kind of thing. So learning from a long history of, for example, anti-racist discourse, first against slavery and then against racism, and then against right-wing racism today, and so on, and systemic racism, as does Black Lives Matter, and so on. Of course, you can say, well, you can say this particular kind of structures in the past were very successful, whatever, Martin Luther King's speech with lots of metaphors and so on has lots of, I don't know, maybe specific kind of structures are more successful, but it depends on the situation, it depends on the context, it depends on the public. There is not just one thing of doing that. So we had many people in the whole movement of the civil rights movement and so on. They were very successful in their speeches, but I don't know whether this was the structures or the content, because the time was right for it, and so on. There's so many conditions which explain why a specific kind of discourse is relevant or not. Black Lives Matter now, also because of the protest against Black victims of police brutality in the United States, the time was right that there were more and more resistant, which 20 or 30 or 50 years ago would be much more difficult. So there's not one way of doing things. We can I hope that people reading the book I did and doing and preparing in a specific situation, for example, debate in Parliament, right? Where you have to make decisions about who can come to the country or not. Now, how do you, in times when the extreme right is getting more and more votes in many countries, like in Holland, my own country, or in Spain where I live, and so on. So what do we have to say to struggle against this particular kind of racist discourse? There's not one strategy, so you can simply say, well, in this particular situation, this kind of public, this kind of context, but this kind of content, things work and other things don't work. There's not one way to do it.
So how do you see the future of discourse analysis evolving, especially in light of AI?
Just doing it better and better. It is, and I can only say I educate students who will be teachers in schools. And as teachers in schools, I hope there will be critical teachers in school who make students in their classes read in a much more critical way, so that they don't easily believe in conspiracy theories and so on, that kind of thing. It's a long way, but as they said in Germany, it's the long trip through all the institutions. That's the way it works. I teach people, where my main work is this, supervising PhD dissertations, and these people will be scholars and they will be teachers and so on. I hope that their students will learn how to look at discourse in a critical way, not only in a precise way of being linguists, but also thinking of the relationship between social structures like inequality, poverty, racism, sexism, Islamophobia, and so on, and also at the same time thinking, yes, but how does it get in the heads of these people? Always these three things. Teach them how to look at the text in a very simple and a very systematic way, look at the kind of social structures being involved, like what exactly is racism going on right now in our university or in our company, in our school, or in the street, in our shops, and so on, and how does that influence what people are thinking. So always to relate these three different kind of things. And I think if you do this kind of multidisciplinary, detailed discourse studies, always several disciplines, we can go much further than we already are today. Also to resist all the let's say, the toxic kind of discourses which are all around us, especially also in the social media. But not only in social media, also in the classical media. Think just of British tabloid newspapers who have been saying these things for many, many years. We didn't have to wait for Facebook or Twitter to wait for these terrible kind of things. So critical discourse studies is absolutely vital at all levels of education, in schools, in universities, and applied in many, many situations. That's one thing. And then if we want to understand how Mr. DeSantis in Florida tries to prohibit textbooks and so on, and his struggle against woke, which of course is quite ridiculous. then of course we know how to analyze this particular kind of thing.
I suppose it'll be interesting to see where AI takes discourse analysis in the future. I'm curious, it seems that we're good at yelling at each other, but we're not very good at unpacking why we're yelling at each other, which makes me wonder. Some people believe that society has never been more polarized, and some believe that we've always been polarized. So I'm curious what you think, and I'm also curious how you navigate difficult conversations with people who have differing beliefs.
To begin with the first part of your question about the polarization, of course, we have been polarized for a long, long time on many issues. If you just think, which is also in my book on anti-racist discourse, the whole debate we had on slavery, and abolition, that went on for decades in many, many, many countries. I mean, it was in Brazil, in the United States, in Europe, in France, and so on and so on. And it is still today. So we have it. Only it's now more obvious because many more people have access to public discourse through the social media. So it looks as if there's much more polarization, but this polarization has been going on for a long time, not only about racism, but also about social class. I mean, what Karl Marx and many others were doing in the 19th century, of course, against all kinds of other people who were anti-communist until today. These debates have been going on for a long, long time. But the people who had access to public discourse, first of all, mostly men, mostly not lower class men, but people with an education and so on, or in the beginning, the fight against slavery, there were priests, and so on and so on. They were not ordinary people. So today, in principle, everyone can participate in this kind of thing. And then we talk about the public sphere of Habermas and many other kinds of things. Of course, it's changing crucially. Many people, and now people, also the weirdest weirdos, have access to millions of people. And that's the problem the social media have to solve, how to make sure that this particular kind of racist discourse does not reach millions. But that's a political decision about that will be another conversation.
Okay. Can we talk about your new paper, The Reactionary Right is Losing the Culture War?
I was interested in radical right parties, not just only here in Spain. We have a right-wing party called Vox, which exists already more than 10 years. And I wanted to compare it also with the party in Chile, in South America, where you have a party called the Republican Party. And of course, a similar party also, the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands. And same right-wing party in Sweden. And I just was interested in how do they talk in a different way? Do they have different ideologies or talk only in a different way? Okay, so finally the paper, because there was no space for all these kind of things, basically the paper is on Vox in Spain. But the point is that the way people at the radical right are formulating it depends also on the social and the political structure. For example, in a Catholic, traditional Catholic country with lots of influence of the Catholic Church in Chile, the first point is against abortion. In Spain, that is still relevant because it's still, the Catholic Church is still powerful and many people are still Catholic. But the majority of the people, also Catholic people, have no problem with abortion. So they cannot put that number one in their program because they will lose votes. In Holland and Sweden, that's not even a point. All right. So it means that specific kinds of ideologies are more or less explicit. And the attitudes means about social issues like abortion, immigration, and so on. So all of them are on immigration and limitation of that. So they're all racist, whether it's South America or in Europe and so on. All right-wing parties are racist because Europeans are basically historically racist in that sense. But the other thing is they adapt to the kind of situation. For example, in Spain, the feminist movement the last years have become quite strong. So one of the main points of the radical right party is to be anti-feminist. So, and they are very strong about this particular kind of thing. That will be no point in Holland and Sweden because feminism is simply part of the consensus, you see. So what happens, the extreme right, is they choose the kind of issues for which they can get votes. And of course, behind them are these the typical ideology of the extreme right, like racism, nationalism, Islamophobia, neoliberalism, and all kinds of other ideologies. But depends on the kind of country and the political situation, what kind of actual attitudes and issues they're going to emphasize or not in their program. So that's the comparison. And then another thing is that it's very typical to say, oh, this is, for example, radical right ideology, as if radical right is one ideology. And I've been working on ideology since many years. And I now said, no, I have to correct my earlier theory. And we are not talking about one ideology, but actually these kind of groups like left and right, or conservative and progressive, all these political configurations, they are not defined by one ideology, but by a cluster of ideology. So, for example, you have a cluster of ideology of racism and nationalism together, called nativism. But sometimes you also have, for example, sexism or machismo together with nationalism. So you have basically, depends on the situation, you have combinations. I'm still looking for a good word for it. I now choose the word cluster, but it's like a combination of ideology, and each group of what we call left, right, progressive, conservative, and so on should be defined by a cluster of ideology, and then the kind of specific attitudes they talk about. So, for example, how and why abortion in the United States is such a big point, and also in Chile and a little bit in Spain still, but not really very interesting in Holland and Sweden. So that's the point I'm interested in this new paper.
Can you talk about populist movements and their leadership and how they differ from the mainstream?
One of the things I wrote in this new paper, only in a very because I've been thinking about these things the whole summer here, reading hundreds of papers on populism and so on. And my conclusion, which is also just 1 minute, because otherwise we take hours to do it, is that many of the people, like, for example, my colleague in the United States is also from Holland. His name is Kat Murray. He's very famous, writing on populism and so on. And he says it's like a thin ideology. Well, I said, Gus, listen, to me, you know a lot about politics and political parties and so on, but you really don't know much about ideology, because the thin ideology is no such kind of thing. You can say we are feminists, racist, and so on, and anti-racist, but to say we are thin what? Thin populist, and it doesn't make sense. There's no a group, there's not a sociological basis of populism. Populism, as other people have said, and I won't detail that now, populism is simply a specific kind of discourse strategy to get to people. You know, it's simply saying we the people, or we the people should, you know, have the power against the elites, which are just corrupt and so on. That kind of strategy has been going on before the notion of populism ever was invented. Much of my analysis of race in the 1980s is about people at the right, saying the people, you know, and so on, before populism. So the notion of a populist party doesn't make sense, but you don't have parties based on the structure of discourse. It's just a strategy to convince people. But what you should say is it is a racist nationalist party or a sexist party and so on and so on. That is correct. A populist party doesn't make any sense. It is not saying, oh, these people use these particular kind of discourse structures. That doesn't make sense, because they also, you could also call them, as you just said, polarization. They all polarize. Does it mean that we have polarizing parties, something like that? Doesn't make sense, all right? So the notion of populist parties, populist and so on, theoretically is a misnomer to say, if you like, right-wing or extremist or radical right-wing or reactionary right-wing party. The word I like today a lot is reactionary right, because most of what they do, like, for example, Mr. DeSantis in Florida, is to react against liberalism. If he sees that people like gay people get more influence, what does the extreme right? To react against that. If they see women get more influence, they react with anti-feminism. If they see that Black people get more power or are being instrument. So most of these parties, actually what they do and think and say are forms of conservative reaction. So not only I would call them radical right, but even I would call them reactionary right. So I will no longer use a word like populist because it's confusing, because it has nothing to do with what they really are.
I liked where you wrote that populism is not an ideology, not a social political structure, and not a new kind of discourse. So much of the hype and debate on populism is just hype.
It has been going on for a long time, and it is very popular. But it is why, like in the social science, it's also the word like frame. Everything is a frame. Frame this, frame analysis. So when I'm a critical analyst also within our in our own field. When everyone is using a notion without actually knowing what they talk about now, populism is a very vague notion, mostly meant to talk about radical right-wing parties and not at the left, although they know there's also populism at the left, but they usually don't talk about it. People say populist party practically always mean parties at the right. So let's just say radical right, reactionary right, illiberal right. Illiberal is also good because they are against liberalism.
Teun, we've been talking about the radical right and radical left and everything in between. And I suppose all of us fall into our respective places in that spectrum. We've observed many families being torn apart around the world because of differing beliefs and ideologies. And I'm curious, what you've learned from your research and what you've learned in life, having had, I'm sure, your own share of difficult conversations, and what advice you might be able to pass along.
Don, I would love to be able to do that because, as I said, I'm typically a teacher. Yes, I always be, but this particular thing also happens in families. I mean, every person in family, me too, have fights with sons, daughters, family, and so on. There is nothing. I mean, the only thing is always try to talk and talk and talk and try to understand the other person is saying. And sometimes talking helps, to get across specific kind of things, because many people have many things which divide them. Let's say during the whole pandemic, whether or not you should accept the limitation government, this kind of thing. And we had all kinds of conspiracy theories about that too. All right. So you can if you talk to people and really talk, and try to understand what the other are saying and say, well, on this particular kind of things, we agree to disagree. For example, that Black people should have the same rights as everyone else and women too, and so on. These are things against people are fundamentally based on unequal norms and values. You cannot simply make a compromise. But it's not always like this, because sometimes also people are there's lots of misinformation, disinformation, and people they're reading the wrong stuff too. I mean, they're not necessarily bad. So it's always fantastic to know what are they thinking, what are they reading and listening to, and why they do so, and try to understand it. And not everyone has to be a teacher and like an analytical teacher, like the things I do, but in everyday life, it makes sense to always try to talk. And certain kind of things, you can simply not write agreement. If they would ask me to have, for example, a television program, to have a conversation with a neo-Nazi, I would say, thank you very much, but no, there's no way we can find common ground, all right? But if it is, shall we or not prohibit the social media, because the social media spreads so much racism and sexism and so on, then we can have different kinds of opinions, yes. And then you have arguments and so on in an academic kind of discussion, which is not the same kind of thing as a discussion around the table and a family dinner.
I'm struck by the idea of wanting to engage in a conversation and trying to find common ground. It seems that more time is spent shutting down conversations than opening them up. You mentioned Alicia Garza from Black Lives Matter earlier, and she said that one of the problems with social movements is that they have become too restrictive, meaning that if you don't think 100% like we do, you can't join, rather than finding out where we can agree and start the conversation from there.
All movements have that kind of thing. I mean, it's the same thing in the Black movement. It has been in the Civil Rights movement. It has also with Black Lives Matter and so what or not kind of things. For example, should you or not? For example, agree to talk also with white policemen and so on, how they do their policing, this kind of thing. So that is another debate, for example, going on also in Spain right here, is what kind of women are part of the women's movement. Can they also be trans? So the whole question of, so there is a part of the women's movement who think that trans women should not be participating in all kinds of women's sports and so on, because it would be unfair to other women because actually they are sort of men still, this kind of thing. So this kind of debate, every movement has it. I mean, who can participate in an anti-racist movement, in a feminist movement, in an anti-gay movement, in for example, everything, like the environmental movement. What do we have to forbid in the countryside or not to be able to be part of the, of the green movement? That's up for debate. And all these movements, since they started in the 18th century, they have been having these debates all the time. The first movements, the abolition movements in 19th century, women could not even speak as women before. I mean, abolition of slavery was much before the women got to vote in the beginning of the 20th century. So in the beginning, and there are interesting texts where women are in favor of abolition of slavery, but they still did not even have rights as women. So you have very interesting questions of when is social movement becoming really democratic? Complicated.
I started this project thinking that I could find some simple answers to many of these questions, and I guess that's just not going to happen. You're right. It's complicated. What haven't we talked about that we should? Where do you go from here?
Well, personally, I mean, as you know, I just became 80. So first of all, I want to live at least 20 years more. That's for starters. And that's important because 5 years ago, I founded the Centre of Discourse Studies in Barcelona, which I financed with the journals I edit, which pay a lot of money, and that's for the center. But I would love to be able to develop the center in something, not just a small outfit as it is now, a bigger, and the things we talk about now, which have to do with all kinds of real serious problems in the world, of which a critical discourse analysis can contribute something together with people from other disciplines. I'm not talking about the level of research and academic. I'm not a journalist, because if I were a journalist, then I would say I would have a movement of journalists, fighting against this particular kind of thing. Let's say all the terrible things of the social media. But I'm a scholar, and I'm interested in critical science, critical discourse analysis, which is my field. And as you mentioned, artificial intelligence and so on, many other things now going on in artificial intelligence also need critical analysis. That's just one topic. And I know a little bit about the topic because I've been working in cognitive science for a long time. So I know a little bit more than many people. So I'm not as, saying, oh, this is dangerous as something. No. I mean, the problem of artificial intelligence is, if you want to quote, the problem of artificial intelligence is what? Human stupidity. Because like with weapons, anywhere, like, atomic weapons and so on, it was human stupidity and human mischief and human badness, which applied. The same thing with artificial intelligence. If there are many people, if you allow many people to abuse these kind of things, of course, it can become dangerous. But so that's why I'm saying the problem is not the machine. It's fascinating what is happening. And I use it also for practical reasons. But the problem is I'm worried not so much about artificial intelligence itself. I'm worried more about human stupidity, racism, Islamophobia, sexism, and so that's my problem, we should much more worry about that than about artificial intelligence.
With so many years in this field, who's been your greatest influence?
I like to say, because many students write me from many, also Arabic countries, many students from many countries, and they say, I'm going to apply your work in my dissertation. And they say, please don't do that. You should never. No, I really mean it. It is silly, because to have one theorist influence your work is absolutely silly. You make people say, okay, I'm a fan of, I admire many things Noam Chomsky has written and said, especially also his political stuff. Doesn't mean that everything he says for me is sort of holy. I learn and have learned from many, many, many people in many, many, many disciplines. Women, especially also women in many countries. So many men and women in many countries, not only in white northern countries, but also in the rest of the world. I've been traveling a lot in Latin America. I visited all Latin American countries. I've given talks in all these countries, and I've learned from that kind of thing. I learn every day from my students in many countries, young women and men, and so on. So I cannot say I have learned from this or this or this great person. I can admire some people more, and I certain, but I may read just to have something in the train to read on a long train ride. A crime story, not because I think it's a great writer, because I don't fall asleep, this kind of thing.
Well, I want you to know that I've learned from many individuals around the world, and you are one of them. And I am most grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you.
I'm honored and very grateful that we could have this talk. Having read most of your work and many of your papers, I'm trying to figure out a way to change the way we think and feel about things one conversation at a time, and trying to understand what we as individuals can do to make those changes. So I'm incredibly humbled and grateful for your time.
And thank you very much for the questions. I hope that if other people are listening, that because of your questions, because of the dialogue we have, that they start to think about kind of things they did not do before. That's what I hope this interview might have as a consequence. That's why I said yes, and that's why I like to do it.
We've been talking with Teun van Dijk. Teun is the director of the Centre for Discourse Studies and professor at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. He's conducted extensive research on the discourse practices of the media, political elites, and other influential actors, showing how they use language to maintain and reinforce their power. It's been a real honor to start this series speaking with Teun. If you'd like to find out more about his work, Teun van Dijk has many books, and you can reach him at the Centre for Discourse Studies in Barcelona. Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones is part of my dissertation project with the University of British Columbia. This radio program and podcast is produced at the Conversation Lab in Vancouver's downtown east side on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. It's available on community and campus radio stations across Canada and your favorite podcasting platform. Please hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss our next episode. Thanks to my supervisory committee, Drs. Manel Matani, Janice Stewart, Denise Ferrara da Silva, Jan Fook, and Andy Hoffman. Of course, my cohort at UBC Social Justice Institute, and friends and family who support this passion project, and Jason Shaw, who composed the music for us. Thanks for listening. I'm Don Schaefer.